The content of this show, Heading in the Right Direction, including discussions, graphics, and any other material you'll see or hear on Heading in the Right Direction, are for informational and educational purposes only. Heading in the Right Direction is not intended to be a substitute for professional help. Dr. Cohen is providing his general opinion on heading in the right direction based on his experience. Dr. Cohen is not your doctor and is not giving you professional advice. Dr. Cohen gives professional advice in private sessions to his patients. If you have a doctor, your doctor should be consulted with any questions you may have about the information you saw on Heading in the Right Direction. If you do not have a doctor, you should seek the services of a doctor and not rely on Heading in the Right Direction. Also, some of the information presented on Heading in the Right Direction is subject to legal protection and may not be used without the permission of Dr. Cohen.
Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Sidney Cohen. I'm a psychologist in private practice in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and I'm your host of the show, Heading in the Right Direction. The topic I'm going to talk about today it's a difficult subject for everyone who guaranteed to experience it at one point or another in life, and that's the subject of loss and grief. What I want to do first is I want to talk about loss as having several different contexts, not just the usual meaning of significant loss for people being, of course, the death of a loved one. That is certainly something I want to address a little bit today, but I want to expand the definition of loss to couple of other categories, meaning, for example, starting with the idea that loss is the ceasing to exist of a significant relationship. Well, that, of course, can occur through the death of a loved one, can also, of course, though, occur through divorce. That is a loss, and it is a significant relationship. Let me mention a couple other types of losses, though, that I do want to address today related to grief. And that's second possibility is the loss of something of financial significance. Which certainly can come about by losing a job or losing a residence. Those can be pretty significant losses by themselves, of course. And the third possibility is something I'm going to characterize as the loss of a significant improvement in a bad situation. And the main example that comes to mind for me with that context is if someone suffers a serious illness or injury, and it's one that's pretty debilitating, so there can be quite a few losses around that, including the loss of the ability to physically and possibly even mentally function the way the person was able to before that illness or injury took place, creating that type of loss. So I do want to include that as an example of a type of loss. Well, what all these types of loss share in common is they're virtually guaranteed to trigger grief, some type of grief, and mainly thinking of grief as sadness. With sadness then being the perfectly natural and human part of what comes from a significant loss connected with grief, I want to still make a distinction here on the degree or intensity of the sadness over significant loss, and not just leave it as kind of black and white, there's a significant loss, therefore there's a lot of grief and sadness. I don't want to leave it at that. So I want to make sort of three categories in terms of how significant and the intensity of the sadness can be. To start with, I'll call it manageable sadness, where, again, whether it's the death of a loved one, the loss of a job, whatever it is, there is certainly sadness that's triggered by that loss. But the amount of sadness, the intensity of the sadness, I call it manageable. It's there. It's certainly something you're conscious of. But it's manageable in the sense, as opposed to the next couple of categories I'm going to get to, it's manageable in that it's not overwhelming. And therefore, for the very most part, you are able to function in your day-to-day life, even with the sadness being present. As opposed to, next category, which I'll describe as there's a deeper sadness. But although there's a deeper sadness, the deeper sadness is not complicated by some other emotions that I'm going to get to, which will be the next category as to what I'll mention those emotions in a moment. So in the second category, the sadness definitely runs deep, but it isn't complicated by some other emotions. However, the ability to function on a day-to-day basis certainly can be challenged, as opposed to then the deepest level of sadness and the deepest level of grief is when there are additional emotions that can kick in that really create what's called complicated grief. So let me get to those emotions. They can be a very important part of the picture, and often enough, in my professional and personal experience, they're not addressed as part of the complicating reality of the grief, the loss of a loved one, divorce, or again, whatever the nature of the loss. So there are three main emotions that can complicate this, complicate the sadness. And the first one is guilt. So guilt can especially come up, especially for the moment dealing with the loss of a loved one, although again, not only, when the person who's suffering the loss and the grief feels as though there is something they either didn't do enough, they didn't say enough, they did something in their own eyes prior to the person's demise that showed resentment, showed kind of almost like a flying off the handle. You hear that a lot in my work. People who are already really racked by the sadness of the loss, and then it's complicated by an emotion or feeling like guilt, which I can virtually guarantee you, in the large majority of instances, is utterly irrational guilt. It's the person's, I call it the inner bully. The inner bully is trying, essentially, to complicate already how much sadness there is over the loss itself by now adding, in a sense, insult to injury. Guilt being a prime example. But now let me get to a second one, and that's anger. Anger can be tricky in the course of the grieving experience. So, for example, in the case of the loss of a loved one, there are instances in which a person can feel angry that the other person passed, period. They're no longer around. There can also be anger at that person if you feel in some way that the person didn't take very good care of themselves. And although it's still terribly sad that they're gone anyway, but perhaps they were overweight, perhaps they smoked, or did anything else that might be considered something reckless and not taking good care of yourself. Anger can surface over that. There's also instances in which, well, especially anger can surface if there's divorce. That you know and I know, most of us are well aware there can be a lot of instances of a lot of anger over that loss. But where anger can also become complicated is for anyone who's religious, or at least spiritual, has a connection to God, because there are instances in which somebody can feel angry at God for, again, mainly death of a loved one, taking the loved one. So sometimes that creates a complication, and then the complication to that complication can be to feel guilty about being angry at God. See, that enough comes up. So, again, anger can be another complication. And the third one is fear and anxiety about if the loss involves a feel, let's say a person if it was there, or a situation like loss of a job, if that person or situation felt like a very significant source of comfort, security. Doesn't matter if you're an adult with adult responsibilities and adult ways of leading your life. If you feel that it is the loss of essentially a rock, there can be fear and anxiety. How am I going to do without that person? What am I going to do without that person? Which usually ends up translating into the person is just underestimating their own resources, could be underestimating the support system they already have in place. But there are people who do experience a good amount of fear and anxiety after the loss of a loved one, which again can complicate the sadness. Okay, next thing I want to touch on. I forget the year, I think it was in the 70s, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote a book called On Death and Dying. Many of you may have heard of it. The book was one of the first books to come out that made a major statement about the process of grieving. And what she mainly talked about is what she described as the 5 stages of grief, which are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and avoidance. Now, in rereading Kubler-Ross's book, she is pretty strong in her belief that there are these stages. And she does make some acknowledgement, is my understanding, that No, there can be some shifting around, but these are the 5 basic stages. Well, the implication to me about that, and colleagues of mine too I've spoken with, is that it almost implies, in fact maybe more than almost, that this is the way to grieve. This is the right way to grieve, to go through these stages. Well, if there's anything I really want to emphasize today, it is that if you've been doing the work that I've been doing for as long as you have and worked with as many people going through the challenging grieving process, you know that there isn't any guarantee whatsoever that there are these 5 stages, much less in this order, much less all 5, etc., etc. Which really gets to one of the main things I want to say today about the grieving process, whichever loss, again, is triggering it. And that is, there is no right or wrong way to grieve. It can be conveyed or communicated, though, by some people, even very loving, well-meaning people, that there's something about the way you're grieving that is not the way it should be or the right way in anyone's best interest, perhaps. Well, there's something about that I really want to be sure to emphasize here in following up on the idea there's no right or wrong way. What actually can happen to enough people is to end up in sort of one of 2 categories, and at risk of oversimplifying, because there's certainly shades of gray here. But again, at risk of oversimplifying it, there are some people who sort of let it all out, and then there are some people who sort of hold it all in. One is not the right way compared to the other. It's a difference in style. It's a difference in the person's reaction to an intense negative feeling like grief and sadness. So, some people let it all out. They let themselves cry. They let themselves talk about it. They let themselves share, as long as, of course, it doesn't become extreme and excessive. If it's not extreme and excessive, there's a real healthiness to that. On the other hand, there are people who don't like to talk about it, don't want to talk about it much, if at all. Tears do not come. There are instances in which people, again, if it's the death of a loved one, will come to the funeral and still not cry. Okay? There are people that happens to. And there are people who don't cry any other time except when they're at the funeral. So the moral of the story, though, is for anyone who is in your life, if you're going through the grieving process, and not only related to the loss of a loved one, but some significant loss, don't let anyone tell you, directly or implied, that there's something about the way you're grieving that is not good, not healthy, wrong. The only way there is any problem is if it's basically controlling you and making it awfully hard to function. Short of that, there is no right or wrong way. Well, the one thing I would add to that, pretty much related actually to what I just said, if, and I think I had mentioned it before, if you're having a problem, being totally honest with yourself, you're having a problem functioning in your life, upholding your job responsibilities, family responsibilities, if you know you're really struggling, that is a problem. And it really would, chances are, be a good idea to get some type of help. Call a therapist, call a clergyman, call a family doctor, whoever it is, but facing again at that point that there is a problem. Also, I want to mention, before I talk a little bit about how to cope with grief, there's a statement someone once made. It was at a conference I was attending on loss and grief. And the statement was, there's no statute of limitations to grieving. And I've been quoting that ever since. Because again, it goes with the idea, there is no right or wrong way. There are people who take a pretty long time, if not a very long time. And then there's others who, it's not that it's not really taking a long time, it's essentially being buried. Of course, when feelings get buried, they get buried alive. So sooner or later, even if they're sort of compartmentalized away, they will need to be addressed. Okay, so why don't we take a short break on that?
In a world where bankers have lost all interest, where robots and fat cats rule our fortunes, one woman will stand up and strive to do the impossible. Be treated like a person. Friends and neighbors will join her quest Ordinary people will band together against the forces of corporate greed. And together, they will form Philadelphia Federal Credit Union, already in a neighborhood near you.
Imagine the finest hand-selected USDA prime steak you'll ever have. The freshest line-caught seafood, our Wine Spectator award-winning wine list, and soul-satisfying desserts. Bring that together with the perfect date, the winning business deal, a memorable family celebration. Welcome to Rod's Steak and Seafood Grill in nearby Morristown, New Jersey. Bring your appetite and feed your passion.
Your credit score is yours, and at Experian Credit Expert, we want to help you really use it. With access to helpful Experian experts over the phone and online, we can help you use it to get a better idea of what info the banks have on you. Use it to get more choice of mortgages. Use it to make your money go further. Take the next step to improving your financial future with your free 30-day trial at Experian.co.uk.
Hi, we're back. I'm Dr. Sidney Cohen, your host of the show, Heading in the Right Direction. And the subject today is the challenging subject of loss and grief. So what I want to do now, having laid out many issues about the subject of loss and grief, so let's talk about how to cope with it. Which certainly, goodness knows, the more painful the loss, a lot easier said than done to cope with it. I want to throw a couple of strategies out. Some of these maybe are kind of obvious. Some of them may not be so obvious. Maybe some food for thought. So let's talk first about self-comfort, where the focus in self-comfort is, by the nature of that term, how to comfort yourself. Not so much turning to others, which certainly is a blessing, not turning, if it is an option for you, to God or something spiritual, turning to a support group. There are times, need I say, when you're alone, by yourself. There's no one else around. And the sadness may hit like a ton of bricks. There are moments like that where we all need to come up with a way for self-comfort. For some people, it might be a diversion, like watch a TV program, read. But there are also things that can be kind of really comforting, like take a warm bath, have a cup of tea. For some people, it might be something like read the Bible. For some people, it could be taking a little teddy bear or something and just kind of cuddling it up. Something that I know that there are enough men can think of that as somehow real men don't do something like that. Well, in times of grief, I don't think it matters anything about what gender you are. You do what it takes when you feel comfort to comfort yourself in a way that fits your style. Again, certainly you can ask for comfort. Again, there can be the option when you need comfort, if you are spiritually oriented, to turn to God in some way or higher power. But there are people who don't believe in God. But atheists still have options, certainly, for getting some kind of spiritual comfort. It could be nature, to take a ride down to the ocean, to take a walk in the woods. It can be very spiritual and very comforting to do something like that. Can also, when it is the grief over the death of a loved one, what for some people is actually very helpful is to create almost a personal memorial in some way. It could be a photo, it could be an item of clothing that is apart from cemetery, gravestone, something that's there with you. It could be at home. And this is not for everyone by any means. There are people that just makes too uncomfortable. For other people, it is a source of comfort. I remember many years ago, I was dating a woman who had lost her best friend about 9 months before, named her mom. And so what she did one night, I felt very privileged and very flattered that she felt comfortable enough to take me in one of the rooms in her house. And what she did was, never forget, sat down in bed, pulled out a picture of her mom, pulled out, I think it was a sweater, sat there, and just had a conversation with her mom, as though her mom were right there, alive. The kind of conversation they would have had if she was still alive. How was the day? Asking her mom for a piece of advice. It was profound to me, but it is definitely not for everyone. It is just one example. But one more I want to give before we take another break is the subject of the Serenity Prayer. Now, for anyone who may not know the Serenity Prayer offhand, the Serenity Prayer says, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Well, connecting that to loss and grief, it can be very hard, awfully hard, to accept a loss of someone that's very special or something as difficult to lose again, job, whatever it is. It'd be very difficult to come to accept that. But if you do come to accept to the best of your ability, my only thing is, I believe that the idea of the Serenity Prayer and surrendering in a very positive sense to that acceptance, it doesn't guarantee serenity, though. So if that prayer is in some way something you do find a bit comforting, my thought is, and it's something I've really discovered for myself, if I can at least reach the point of acceptance, and there are some things in my personal life that are very difficult to accept. Without spelling them out, they're very hard. I am working to come to accept these things. Been a real challenge to come to accept them. Serenity, that's another matter. But I've come to believe that if you're facing a significant loss and you have to come to accept it, it'll take a while before you can feel serenity about it. But the idea of surrendering in the sense of coming to accept it, in its own way, I think it's an important part of the grieving process. One more thing, though, before we take a break. I want to quote a supervisor of mine back in another lifetime when I was still an intern. Brilliant man, kind of eccentric, but a brilliant man. And one of the things he said about loss and grief is, very subtly, that what's involved in loss is the loss of, and as he put it, the illusion that the situation or relationship would always be there as long as you're alive. So if someone dies, deep down inside you had the illusion they'd always be there. You logically knew, of course, that may very well not be the case. You might have had the illusion you'd always have your job. You might have had the illusion you'd always have your marriage. That loss, the loss of that, I'm not just going to call it belief, I'm going to call it illusion. That illusion dies when the loss is there. And that in its own way, kind of a subtle way perhaps, but a very significant way, is very much what the grieving process can be about. The illusion is over. And that's very sad. So, that said, after the break, I want to answer a couple of questions that came in through email, and we'll take a couple-minute break on that note.
Here at Freppi's Tex-Mex, you can definitely taste the freshness in our food. You should definitely come to Freppi's because it's a great place. You can bring your family, very kid-friendly. All my servers are amazing, friendly people. Everyone here is just happy to serve, and I think it shows. The thing that sets us apart is the quality and freshness of our food. And I think once you try it, you'd be coming back. I'm Joe DeSario, co-owner of Freppi's Tex-Mex in Plainfield, New Jersey.
Welcome back. Dr. Sidney Cohen. This is Heading in the Right Direction. I have a couple of questions that came in through emails to my network website. And I want to go over these because amongst many questions that came in, these were the three that really stood out for me as worth, I think, addressing to an audience that has these kinds of questions and issues that might come up. All right, so the first one is, what's the worst thing and the best thing to say to someone who is grieving? I think it's a very important issue. And I'm going to start with the worst thing. Worst may be a little strong, but things I advise, if possible, to not say. For example, and typically the kinds of things that a lot of people do say, even well-meaning, caring people. But the things you especially want to try to avoid are things like, it's time to move on. Just get over it. anything of those kind of statements. To me, those are the statements. One other example comes to mind. In some instances, for some people especially, may not be at all religious, it could be a statement like, well, they're in God's hands. Even a statement sometimes like they're out of their suffering. Again, obviously assume it's the death of a loved one. Even a statement like that, it can certainly be intended to be some consolation. But especially going back to the first couple of statements, just move on, time to get over it, those statements can be experienced as insensitive, especially if the depth of the sadness is still there. So I recommend really try to avoid statements like that. On the other hand, what to say? What to say is statements that reflect that you understand they're really still hurting, that there's plenty of reason to still be hurting. Statements that convey that empathy and compassion in any and every way possible. It could also be just asking the person, what do you need? How can I be of any help? There are people in states of grief that tremendously appreciate that. It could be you do nothing more than just listen. Don't jump in with advice. Don't jump in with cliches. Don't jump in with feedback. That to me is a really good way to be of a true friend, family member for somebody in a state of grief. Okay. Next question. Can you try to get someone who's grieving to have some fun and get a few laughs in through their emotional pain and suffering? Again, I think it's a really good question, an important question. When a person's in a deep state of grief, it is, of course, very hard to have any fun, to laugh, to do the kinds of things that are normally done if you're not in a deep state of grief. Well, part of what can complicate that sometimes is, especially again if it's the death of a loved one, sometimes what kicks in is a person, and they can actually think this way consciously, or maybe it's deep down, like, I'm not supposed to. I'm not supposed to laugh. I'm not supposed to have fun. I'm supposed to be grieving. Well, when I look at that, I remember again, this is also at a seminar, the presenter pointed out something, and I had heard it in other places that I thought was really right on. And that's basically, as one option, to say to yourself, what do I really believe my loved one would want me to do? Would they want me? Would they feel it is the only way to show my devotion and loyalty to their memory to stay really sad? Or might they say, hey, we all need a good laugh sometimes. We all need to go out with people and, just kind of let loose a bit. So my feeling on the subject is, if you can help somebody see that and be there while knowing they're still really in a lot of pain, I think it's very healthy. And I'm also reminded of a quote at a moment like this from Joni Mitchell. For anyone who may not remember Joni Mitchell, generational thing to some degree, I figure, Joni Mitchell was a wonderful singer and songwriter who wrote poetry to me in her music. So she has a line in her song, and the line is, laughing and crying, it's the same release. I love that line. I think it's brilliant. And I think what it captures is that it isn't just crying. I mean, the idea people go around saying, I had a good cry. Yeah, you had a good cry. There's no such thing as a bad cry. A good cry is a release. And it's human, again, in the state of deep sadness. But laughter's a release, too. And in a way, struck me one day, stretching the point a little bit, if you think about it, in a way, since they both are emotional releases, the only difference in a way between them is we know we enjoy one of them. It's hard to enjoy crying, but it is still a release. But so is laughter. So, I don't know if it's always the best medicine, as they say, but it is really a good dose of medicine, even through a state of grief. Okay, one more question. At a talk I heard you give on loss and grief, you offered a quote that had the word liberated in it. And I found it very interesting, but I don't remember the quote. Can you say it? I sure can. Long story short, I was at a seminar, professor emeritus of the University of Pennsylvania, 70-something-year-old man, talking about doing therapy with the elderly, especially in a state of grief. To cut to the chase, tells us he lost his wife of 50 years a year ago. She meant the world to him. Loved her. It was a terrible loss. So all of us are sitting there and we're, tears are starting to flow for all of us. And what he said, I'll never forget. And he said, Now he said, I appreciate very much, because it is very sad. He said, in 1 year I've learned a lesson that I never would have thought of or believed. And the words that he came out with, every loss can be liberating. And I remember we sat there and were struck by liberating. How can you be liberated when you've lost your spouse at 50 years? His point was, although he loved her dearly, and they did enough together, there were things they didn't share together that he had always wanted to do. So, what he did in that year, he traveled. She really never wanted to travel. She had always wanted to learn to dance. She never wanted to dance. He took a ballroom dance class. Not every loss is going to be liberating, no. But if there's a piece where as part of your transition, you add something to your life that wasn't there prior to the loss, it is a form of liberation through the grief. Okay, before I wrap up, let's take one last quick break.
When we make Beyond Natural dry dog and cat foods, we start with real meat as the first ingredient. We leave out corn, wheat, and soy. And we own where our dry food is made. 100%. Can other brands say all that? For nutrition you can trust and your pet will enjoy. Does your food go beyond? Learn more at purinabeyond.com.
Hi, Dr. Sidney Cohen, heading in the right direction. I want to thank you very much for tuning in today. I hope you found some of this or a good deal of this useful as some food for thought for yourself and for people around you, perhaps, who are going through their own loss and grief and bereavement. I will be back. There'll be some more shows coming up for sure. I'd also like to make very clear that I would absolutely welcome people to email me. The information about how to reach me is here on the screen. So please feel free to contact me, and I guarantee you that I will get back to you. It's been my pleasure to be here today, as it's been all the shows that I've done. And again, thank you for watching.